All right, class, today we're going to jump into chapter 6, which is cellular respiration. And this is how we're going to find out how the animal cell and actually just how cells use the mitochondria to break down sugars to form ATP. So before we jump into cellular respiration, we still have to do a little bit more on energy. And the first thing we're going to look at here is our energy cycle. And specifically, this is going to be our energy cycle in life. And so with our energy cycle, we have two kind of main forms of organisms out there. We have what we call our autotrophs, and our heterotrophs. So autotrophs are those organisms that make their own energy. And so that's mainly going to be like our plants. Because they make energy from the sun, they don't have to go out and consume. So they're auto, which means they're doing it on their own. And then our heterotrophs, which are going to be our consumers. So here we have our producers. And this is mainly going to be animals. I'm simplifying this. There's obviously more living organisms besides plants and animals, but this is just an easy way to see it. And they're going to be our consumers. And they get their energy from consuming other organisms. So this could be like a deer that's eating grass, or this could be like a mountain lion eating that deer. So they get their energy by consuming those different organisms. And so we're going to draw kind of a picture of this energy cycle and how it works. So here we have our human, who's going to be our heterotroph, and we have our plant, which is going to be our autotroph. And so there are a few things that plants need to get this energy, to make their own energy. And that is going to be carbon dioxide and water. And also the sun. So when plants use the sun, carbon dioxide, and water, they are able to create products from that. And the products they create from that are going to be sugar, which is C6H12O6, and oxygen, which is O2. Now, for us as humans to do cellular respiration, in other words, for us to be able to break down sugar molecules into ATP or energy, we need oxygen and sugar. And our products from this are going to be carbon dioxide and water, which happens to be the reactants needed for the plant, and then the plant's products become the reactants for us. And then the energy we get out is ATP. And so what we see here is that energy cycle that I wrote up here between our consumers and our producers, between our autotrophs and our heterotrophs. This constant cycle that what we need is what are the products of what the other organism needs. And so once again, we talked last time about the conservation of energy. You can see the energy conserved. It's just changing from one form to another. Even the sun energy is eventually converted into that ATP. So all that energy is going to be conserved. So with that, let's talk about aerobic. So anytime you hear the word aerobic, so if you think of like exercise, aerobic exercise, what aerobic means is something that requires energy. Not energy, actually, sorry. Something that requires oxygen. And so when you think of aerobic exercises are exercises that you're doing something for a long time. So that could be like running, that could be like jumping jacks, that could be like yoga, that could be anything where you're doing some type of endurance type of exercise. And the reason why it's aerobic is because it requires energy, oxygen. You need to have that oxygen to constantly be able to do that exercise. So you're going to be breathing in, breathing out as you're running and whatnot. And the oxygen is needed to be able to create the energy you need for that exercise. Now we also have anaerobic, which is without oxygen. And we're going to see that later on, how things work anaerobically. So an anaerobic exercise would be like lifting a weight, where you're doing it really quick. You're not using a lot of oxygen. We'll actually see how that's different from aerobic exercise, and specifically how it deals with cellular respiration. So with this, we want to now give a really good definition for cellular respiration. And it is the aerobic harvesting of chemical energy from organic molecules. All right, so aerobic harvesting of chemical energy from organic molecules. So let's break this down a little bit. Aerobic, so here, requires oxygen. So we know we're going to need oxygen. Harvesting, so we're just gathering something of chemical energy. So our chemical energy is going to be our ATP. So pretty much creating ATP from organic molecules. Our organic molecules are our sugar. So in other words, cellular respiration is the process that takes oxygen and sugar to create ATP. That's what cellular respiration is. And that happens inside our mitochondria, that power plant of the cell. And you can see that here, we have oxygen and sugar that are gonna go into the human. So you're breathing, you're consuming food, and you're gonna get out that ATP. So that's all what cellular respiration is, creating ATP from sugar and oxygen. Now, to understand this, we have to learn kind of the role of oxygen. So the role of oxygen in this whole process is helping to transfer electrons from one molecule to another. So I'm going to do this. This stands for electrons. You're going to see this a lot. And so this is why we need oxygen. Oxygen is what helps burn the fire, what helps burn the sugar, what helps burn the gas in all of our explanations. But it does that by transferring electrons. And I'll give you an example of that. So when we're drawing this out, we want to have a formula for cellular respiration. And that formula looks like this. So the formula is we're going to put these numbers in and get out these numbers. All right, so these are our reactants and these are going to be our product. So when we have sugar, which is C6H12O6, and oxygen, they're going to go into the mitochondria and we're going to come out with water, which is 6 molecular water, so 6H2O, and carbon dioxide, and we're going to have 6 of those. And our ATP, so our cellular energy. Our quarters that we talked about last time. So really, sugar, oxygen goes through the mitochondria, we create water, carbon dioxide, and our energy. So this is the most important part. These here are going to be waste products. We don't necessarily need them. That's why we exhale our carbon dioxide. We do need water, but we also use water when we're trying to excrete things in our urine and whatnot. So we water down nitrites that hurt us and into urea. So we can say that that's where that water is wasted there. So the biggest thing we want is that ATP, that energy. And so when we're thinking of the role of oxygen, what's really happening when we talk about the movement of electrons, we're really talking about hydrogens. So if we go back to our chemistry discussion and we draw our hydrogens, remember a hydrogen is the very first element on the periodic table. picture. Not gonna be able to see the picture very well, I assume. Remember, it's this very first one right here, which means it has an atomic number of 1, which means it has 1 proton and it has 1 electron. So when we're talking about the transfer of electrons, we're actually talking about the electron that's found, this 1 electron that's found in this hydrogen atom. And so we're going to be seeing this when we look at this later on in the chapter. When we do cellular respiration, we're going to see the movement of this electron. And what ends up happening is that the electrons that are part of these 12 hydrogen atoms here, they're going to end up moving to our oxygen, which then creates our water, right? Because if you add all of your hydrogens to the oxygens, then you end up creating the water. And so that's the movement, that's the role that oxygen playing here. It's helping move these electrons and pretty much stealing the electrons from this larger molecule to make a smaller molecule, and the energy that's released from this creates our ATP. And then what you end up doing is you leave your carbon and your oxygens here that create your carbon dioxide, just as a waste product. So that's the role of oxygen, is to move these electrons, to take these electrons from our hydrogen and move them over to this oxygen here. So if you remember far back when we talked about oxygen, that it's highly electronegative, when we talked about the shape of water and how oxygens really love electrons, that's the reason why this can work. And that's why we have to have oxygen in this whole process, is because they love electrons so much that they can help steal these electrons from the sugar molecule here to create the water, and then the energy that's released from that, we can create our ATP. And we're going to walk you through this whole process here in a little bit. 2 more things we got to talk about here before we jump into that. This whole process of moving electrons with oxygen is called the oxidative reductive reaction. Okay, kind of big, oxidative reduction reaction. And what we're saying here is that some of these molecules are going to be oxidated, and some are going to be reduced. So we're going to have oxidation and we're going to have reduction. So oxidation is going to be the loss of an electron. Where reduction is going to be the gain of an electron. So you would think reduce, shouldn't we be losing, but we're actually talking about the positivity of that molecule. If we're gaining an electron, it's becoming more negative, so we reduce its positivity. That's right, it's what we call reduction. And then oxidation, we usually call it oxidation because it's the oxygen that's pulling away that electron from the original molecule. So when we showed here in our picture, we had our C6H12O6 plus our 6O2. So here, our sugar is going to be oxidized because the oxygen here is going to take away the 12 hydrogens. And then because of that, we're going to create our water, 6H2O, through this process. And so our water becomes reduced because we're adding the hydrogens onto the oxygen and reducing the water. So we're going to see now here we're going to give it a bit of an example of how this actually works, that whole oxidation reduction. And for this example, kind of think of a dam and all the water that is behind that dam. So if you think about it, that dam is stopping that river from flowing. So there's a bunch of energy behind that dam. If we were to explode that dam, you can imagine all the water that's going to be rushing down downstream. Well, instead, what we do is we have little tunnels, and in those tunnels, we have kind of these turbines. These turbines will then be in those tunnels, and as the water rushes through, it's going to turn those turbines, and we're going to take the energy from that to create electricity. And that's how dams create electricity, by using all that stored energy of the water behind to turn these turbines to create that electrical current and that electricity that we use. Now with our electron here, so here we have our electron. So our electron here, we're going to send it through kind of the same idea, this tunnel that's got these turbines where we're going to take away this energy. And at the very bottom, we're going to have our oxygen, because we want to have our electrons that come from our hydrogen. So remember, those electrons come from those hydrogens, and we want to combine them to create our water. Now, one thing you might know is that this reaction of having hydrogens and oxygens come together to create water is actually a very explosive reaction. And I don't know if many of you had a chance this last weekend to watch the SpaceX launch in Florida with NASA, where they were able to send the first rocket to space that was funded by a private entity, which is going to open up a lot of crazy, awesome opportunities for space travel here in the future. But if you notice in that reaction, there was a huge, like if you're looking at the jet or the rocket that was sent up, there's huge amount of energy required to send a rocket up into space. Now, if you didn't see this one that happened this weekend, I'm sure you've seen videos of past rocket launches, and you can just imagine all the energy it takes to launch a rocket up into space. Well, that energy comes from oxygen and hydrogen. And so you'll have one tank inside that rocket that's full of oxygen, one tank in that rocket that's full of hydrogen. And when they do the countdown, hit the ignition to blast off, what ends up happening is our oxygen is released and our hydrogen is released to create water. And that reaction creating water is what actually sends the rocket up into space. So it's a very explosive reaction, creates a lot of energy, as you can imagine, to be able to send a rocket up into space. All right, so maybe this might concern you that we're doing this same reaction inside our cells. That might be pretty bad, right? We have all these little explosions happening inside our cells and in our body. Well, that's why we need to take energy away from it before it hits here. And so what we do is, as our electron goes down these steps in our cellular respiration process here, so these steps are the cellular respiration. Each time it hits one of these turbines, we take energy out. Just like we take energy out and create electricity, this time our energy that we're taking out is to create ATP. So what that does is, by the time our electron now meets up with our oxygen, you're not going to have this huge explosion. We're not going to have a huge problem with this reaction. And then what that does now is it allows our creating of the water, but it allows us at each one of these steps to take ATP away from, or energy away from the electron to create our ATP. And that's what this whole process is going to end up being about. So in our the last part of this chapter, in our next video, we're going to be showing how we go through, there's 3 different stages of cellular respiration. And now in each stage, certain things happen so that we can take our energy out to have the energy for our cell to work, but also create that water and not have it be a huge explosion.